Okay, friends, we are going to get started. Welcome to Pub Theology. I am so glad you're here. I know you're not listening to me, and that's awesome. That means you're having a great time. I am just going to keep talking until I get louder than you. All right. Good evening. Friends, my name is Ken Brannon. I am the Vice Rector at St. Michael and All Angels Episcopal Church. By the way, come see us anytime you're in our area. We're in Preston Center, and we'd love stmichael.org with saint spelled out. We'd love to see you. We'd love to visit with you. We do this on purpose in a pub. Listen to the name of the thing, Pub Theology. Pub to enjoy and relax, theology to actually reflect on some pretty deep topics. And so we come in a place like this where we can explore a topic, ask questions, be ourselves. We do it every summer. And so tell your friends. Please join us whenever you can. For those of you who just walked in, and you may have already heard the news, our taco guy forgot. He is in a pool very far away from Dallas. He's very sorry, and I'm sure Bob is going to make sure he's sorrier, but he'll probably be here next Monday. But St. Michael Church has decided to buy pizza and treat everybody. So it's on its way. Enjoy a piece of pizza or more when it comes. And a huge thank you to Tish and to Colleen for making that happen. Let's hear it for pizza. All right. To get started tonight, we're going to listen to some music. And we have a new musician to Pub Theology. His name is David Tribble. And let me just say a few words about him. I love this. A former middle school teacher, now living in Fort Worth, David brings his soulful sound as singer-songwriter to the scene. His music spans the folk, indie, and Americana genres. He recently released his third album, Golden Junk, a collection of personal songs, new and old, and his most vulnerable album yet. I do also understand that he's got a briefcase over there in the back. He's selling some of his music. So if you like what you hear tonight, go back, pick up a CD, or just talk. I assume it's a CD. It used to be CDs. Whatever, shirt, it's something. But talk to him if you like his music. David, we'd like to welcome you to Pub Theology.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know what a CD is, but I don't have any of those CDs hanging around. In my car, maybe. Oh, man, thank you so much. How you doing, guys? Pretty cool, right? This is a really cool place to be tonight on a Monday and to be here with you guys. And thank you to Justin for having me. And excited to share some music with you. I'm from Fort Worth, Texas, so not too far away. And yes, I am a former middle school teacher, so I survived that, and the rest is downhill, you know. Any other teachers in the house? Hey, yeah, it's summertime, right? We're happy. I'm sharing an older tune with you called How Much Easier. How much easier would it be? How much easier would this world be if you would get along with me? And these bills were paid. Would we get a little sleep tonight? Would we find our peace of mind without the beat of the world drowning out the sounds that we all love to hear, trying to bring us all down? The question isn't whether or not it will, but that when it's gone, will we even notice? How much easier it would be, how much easier easier this world would be. Love was the war. We knew what we were fighting for. Would we get a little more sleep tonight? Would we find our peace of mind without the beat of the world drowning out the sounds we all love to hear? Time to bring us all down. The question isn't whether or not it will, oh, but that when it's gone, will we even notice? How much easier, how much easier it would be, how much easier, how much easier this world would be. Would we get a little more sleep tonight? Would we find our peace of mind without the beat of the world? Time to bring us all down. The question isn't whether or not it will, oh, but that when it's gone, will we even notice? How much easier, how much easier this world would be. How much easier, how much easier this world would be. How much easier it would be. Thank you, folks. Thank you. Thank you so much. Rushes in like a flood by your grace and your grace alone. In your arms I'll be like feathers. In your arms I will be like. Won't grow weary and I won't grow thin, and I'll fly like the eagle flies. In this race I run, oh, you lift me up, you lift me up, up, up. You lift me up, up, up. You lift me light as a feather. I'll be light as a feather. You lift me up, up, up. You lift me up, up, up. You lift me light as a feather. Oh, the weight has been lifted, and I lay me down, and I lay me down. Light as a feather I'll be, light as a feather I'll be, light as a feather. In your arms I'll be like feathers. In your arms I will be like. You lift me up, up, up. You lift me up, up, up. You lift me light as a feather. I'll be light Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
David, that was fantastic. Thank you. We're going to get to hear from you again in a little bit. Let me tell you a little bit about the structure of what we're doing tonight. We begin with a 35 to 45-minute talk. There's a 10-minute break where the speaker gets to kind of look at all the questions that have been generated and think about how to organize them and how to respond. And then there's Q&A for 20 minutes. So what I want you to know is on your table, in the little bin on your table, there's a couple of things. One, I think, is going to be like a survey. Give us your thoughts about the format, about the speakers, the singers, anything you want to tell us about. It helps us as we plan. But more importantly, there's a question sheet on there. And so as you listen, go ahead and jot down what your questions are, and then we'll collect those during the break and make sure that Matt can take a look at those. Before I introduce the speaker, I love this part. We have to say that whatever the speaker says are his views. It does not necessarily represent the views of St. Michael Church. However, if I stand on my table and clap, it means that I really liked it. But otherwise, we really can't say that it's the views of St. Michael Church. Let me introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Matthew Lockard, Matt. He's an associate professor of philosophy at Southern Methodist University. He obtained both his PhD and master's in philosophy from the University of California at Los Angeles. Dr. Lockard specializes in epistemology and philosophy of mind. His areas of competence focus on early analytics philosophy, ethics, logic, and philosophy of language. Now, I'm going to tell you a couple of the articles he's written, just the titles, and when I tell you I don't understand the titles, it means that it's good he's doing what he's doing and I'm doing what I'm doing. These are the articles he's written. Closure provides no relief from the problem of easy knowledge. Implication and reasoning in mental state attribution, comments on Jane Heal's theory of co-cognition. Epistemic instrumentalism, that's my favorite. And a review of Keith Hasek, The Metaphysics of Knowledge. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Lockard. Matt, thank you for coming.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. It's really fun to be here. I was here last week, and what a great community this is. It's really a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here with you today. So, just away. All right, I talk with my hands, so if I can get through this without knocking this over or without stepping off the back and falling, that's going to be, I'm going to consider that a win. All right, so my topic tonight is how we know things. But I caught it. All right. I mean, it's going to happen at least once more, don't you know? Okay. So my topic tonight is how we know things in the place of faith, but how we know things is kind of it's a question that can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. All right, we're going to get somebody. What are you doing, Justin? All right. Yeah, I think it's this one. It's a little wonky. What was it that? Man who knows his microphones. Outstanding, thanks. But you know, I'm going to fiddle with it and mess it up probably. But okay, so the topic is how we know things in the place of faith. And this question of how we know things can actually be interpreted in two different ways. And one way of interpreting that question, how do we know things, is not what I do. So the question of how we know things can be asked as a question about the processes by which we form beliefs. Like, how do we actually go about acquiring knowledge? And that's actually a question for psychology. That's what psychologists study. Cognitive psychologists conduct experiments. They have labs where they look at the actual psychological processes that lead people to form different kinds of beliefs under different sorts of conditions. That work is super interesting, and a philosopher who works in epistemology, which is my field, is very, very interested in the work that psychologists do on how our beliefs are actually formed. But I work in this branch of philosophy that I just mentioned. It's called epistemology, And that asks some slightly different questions about knowledge. It's not so much a question about how we actually acquire our beliefs, the psychological processes that underpin a belief formation, but instead, what an epistemologist asks is questions like this. What is knowledge in the first place? Like, what's the difference between knowing something to be true and just having a belief that happens to be true, but you don't really know it to be true? What does it mean to have a belief that's actually rational or based on good evidence or a belief for which you have good reasons? Like, what does that even mean? That's the kind of question that a philosopher who works in epistemology works on. Okay, so epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of knowledge and of rational belief, and that's kind of how I earn my bread, is working in that area. And what I want to talk with you about tonight is this sort of relationship between faith and reason, and that's a daunting task in 50 minutes, an hour, was that it? No. So there's a lot of reasons why we're not going to be able to plumb the full depths, so I'm going to be very interested to see what the questions are. But the main reason is because there's just a lot of open questions. There's a lot of things that philosophers have not been able to figure out about the nature of rational belief. There's a lot of things philosophers have not yet been able to figure out about what faith is and about the relationship between faith and rationality. But we've been able to make a little bit of progress in these areas. And so what I'm going to do tonight is just talk about some things about the nature of rationality. We're going to talk about the nature of faith and religious belief. We're going to say a few things about how these things are related and hopefully, give you some categories for understanding at least how philosophers think about some of these things. By no means are my views like representative of what all philosophers think or anything like that. If you can find two philosophers who agree on anything, it's a good day. But at any rate, hopefully we can at least clear up, I think, some misconceptions about the nature of the relationship between faith and reason. So I'm going to get my notes. So the first misconception I want to try to debunk, I guess, tonight has to do with a thought along the following lines. So here's an argument that religious belief is irrational. And the argument's very simple. It just goes like this. There's no good evidence for religious beliefs. Beliefs that are not based on good evidence are irrational. Therefore, religious beliefs are irrational. Right? That's a pretty straightforward argument. And if I was a Christian apologist, somebody who does Christian apologetics, what I would try to do is dispute that first claim that there's no good evidence in support of religious belief. I would try to wheel out arguments like the ontological argument for the existence of God, the design argument for the existence of God, the first cause argument for the existence of God. So if you've taken an intro to philosophy class or a philosophy of religion class, maybe you know what I'm talking about. But if you don't worry, because that's actually not what I'm going to be doing tonight. Instead, I want to look at the second claim that it's only by having good evidence that your belief can be rational. Okay, there's a name for that assumption, and it's called evidentialism. All right, so normally I would charge people for teaching you philosophical terminology like this. This is what those SMU students, they pay top coin for this kind of terminology. But I'll give it to you tonight for free. The word is evidentialism, okay? And evidentialism is the view that a belief can only be rational if it's based on good evidence. So how could you possibly dispute that? Why would anybody think that there's anything to even debate about that? It sounds like a truism. It sounds like something that's too obvious to be even worth debating, that a rational belief is a belief that's based on sufficient evidence. But I actually think not only is this not a truism, I don't even think it's true. Okay, in fact, I think it's pretty obvious that this belief is false. And in fact, actually, I can say this with a reasonable degree of confidence, that most people who work in epistemology, whether they're theists or atheists, would also think that evidentialism is false. But it's a very common view. I certainly see it in popular discussions of religious belief. And so I want to say a bit about it and why I think it's false. So this view, evidentialism, the view that you're only rational in believing something to the extent that it's based on evidence, comes from, well, there's a number of places where it kind of comes from, but sort of the first time we see a full-throated defense of this claim is in the late 19th century. There was a Cambridge philosopher named W.K. Clifford who wrote a paper called The Ethics of Belief, in which he articulates this view. So I've got a little quote from you. It's really good stuff, so it's worth reading, actually. Clifford says, if a belief has been accepted on insufficient evidence, the pleasure is a stolen one. Not only does it deceive ourselves by giving us a sense of power which we do not really possess, but it is sinful because it is stolen in defiance of our duty to mankind. That duty is to guard ourselves from such beliefs as from a pestilence which may shortly master our body and spread to the rest of the town like COVID. Oh, I added that part. To sum up, it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Now, as a matter of fact, Clifford himself thought that religious belief is precisely one of those things for which there's insufficient evidence, so he thought it was irrational to have religious beliefs. Now, I want to separate kind of two ideas in these quotes from Clifford. One idea is that just the simple view that I've already stated a few times, evidentialism, the view that it's irrational to hold any belief unless you possess sort of convincing evidence of its truth. There's a second theme there which has to do with the ethics of this. It's really that it's sort of immoral to believe something on the basis of insufficient evidence. I want to leave that part of it aside. I'm kind of interested in that question, but the part that's relevant for our talk tonight has to do with this first point. Could it ever be rational to believe something on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, perhaps? And actually, I think it absolutely is, in some cases, perfectly reasonable to believe some claims in the absence of anything that could reasonably be regarded as evidence in favor of its truth. So to defend this point of view, first of all, we have to say something about what evidence is. So let me just put it this way. I think what most people mean by evidence, and it's certainly I think what most philosophers think of when they think of evidence, is what philosophers call empirical evidence. So what's empirical evidence? Empirical evidence is evidence that we acquire. It's information about the world that we acquire through the five senses. For example, here's a question. Are there more than 10 people at this lecture right now? Yes. Okay, now how do you know? You can look around. You can just look around, and you don't even have to really count. You can just kind of do a quick look and tell that there's more than 10 people here in the room watching this lecture in person. Now, that's an example of what we would call an empirical belief. It's a belief that you know to be true, and the reason you know it to be true is because you're having certain specific sensory experiences, mainly visual experiences, that confirm the truth of that claim, that there's more than 10 people in the room right now. Okay, so that's an example of what I think philosophers are talking about when they're talking about evidence. They're talking about empirical evidence, information about the world that we acquire through the five senses. Now, empirical knowledge is knowledge that's based on empirical evidence, and sometimes our empirical beliefs, our beliefs that are based on our sensory experiences, involve very simple claims that can kind of be confirmed on the basis of a single sensory experience or kind of at a given time, like your belief that there's more than 10 people in this room right now. But of course, the empirical sciences are full of generalizations about the natural world that we know on the basis of not of any individual sensory experience, but repeated observations. So for example, take a generalization like Newton's law of gravitational attraction. Bodies attract each other with a gravitational force that's proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them, okay? That's, yeah, okay, so my high school teacher would be proud. Okay, so how do we know that to be true? I take it is true, and the reason we know it to be true is through repeated observation. Okay, so it's not that any one person saw a particular thing that confirmed the truth of that generalization. It's a generalization. It's a claim about all bodies, right? But it's a claim that we're reasonably confident is true because we've had lots of observations that kind of confirm the truth of that claim. So you can literally set up telescopes, you can make measurements, you can, I don't know, okay, I'll stop before I expose my ignorance of how physicists do their thing, but you get the idea that it's based on repeated observations that people, at the end of the day, are doing using their five senses. So the claims of physics, biology, chemistry, many of the social sciences, psychology, are based ultimately on evidence that we acquire through our five senses. So if that's what evidence is, then I think Clifford's claim that the only things you can rationally believe are things that are based on empirical evidence of that sort is clearly false, and let me give you a couple of reasons to think so. One reason to think so is because just intuitively, if you think about it, there's a lot of things we rationally believe that we don't believe on the basis of empirical evidence. So to give you an example of this, take mathematics. I know that there's infinitely many prime numbers, right? Now, how do I know that? Well, the trick is if you just take any initial sequence of prime numbers, multiply them together and add 1, you get a new prime number. So there's just a procedure you can use for just generating new prime numbers as long as you want. So how do I know that there are infinitely many prime numbers? Well, basically because I just understand how multiplication works. I know what it means to factor a number into its prime factors, and so on. And so I don't know that on the basis of my sensory experiences, right? It's not like I could set up a telescope or conduct a survey or, under a microscope, check to see how many prime numbers there are. It looks like our mathematical beliefs are not based on empirical evidence. They're based on something like understanding of mathematical concepts. Okay, so that's one example. Here's another example. What about moral beliefs? Like the belief that it's wrong to murder somebody for pay. Okay, I think that murdering somebody just for financial gain is wrong. Hope you all agree with me. And how do we know that? Do we set up a double-blind experiment and sort of say, okay, over here we're going to have the murders for hire, and over here we're not, and we'll just kind of, no, you just can't do that, not only because you would never get funding for this, but because suppose you were to do that. Suppose you tried to observe the wrongness of murder for hire. What would it look like, right? What would it sound like? What would it taste like? What would it smell like? How do you use your 5 senses to detect moral wrongness, like the objectionability of murdering somebody for money? That's not the kind of thing that you can confirm or even disconfirm through empirical observation. Not that empirical claims are totally irrelevant to morality, and if you want to, if we want to get into subtleties, I'm happy to address that in the Q&A. But our knowledge of basic moral truths doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that we can know on the basis of our sense experiences. Nevertheless, it seems perfectly reasonable, perfectly rational to believe that it's wrong to murder somebody for money. There's a few outlandish examples I can't help myself from mentioning because they're so dear to philosophers' hearts. One example that was raised in many places throughout the history of philosophy, but it's sort of most famously raised by the philosopher René Descartes. Have you heard of René Descartes? All right, fill in the blank. I think, therefore. All right, there you go. So you know some Descartes. So Descartes writes in his Meditations on First Philosophy, the series of 6 meditations, and the first one begins with the worry that maybe Descartes' own sensory experiences are just one grand illusion. He's worried that maybe he's nothing but a disembodied mind that is having all of his current sense experiences fed into him by an evil demon. Now ask yourself, how do you know that I'm talking to you right now? How do you know that you're sitting in a chair listening to a lecture? Well, presumably on the basis of your sense experiences, but now here's a question. How do you know that your sense experiences are revealing the world to you as it actually is? How do you know your brain wasn't removed from your body last night while you were asleep and taken to a lab where it was plugged into a computer that generates an illusion of you being at the lecture when actually, et cetera? Do you see the point? Okay. That's called the problem of skepticism about our empirical knowledge. And, no philosophers ever come up with a good argument to shoot down that possibility. It seems like we take the reliability of our sense experiences for granted, but if you were to ask me, what sense experience do I use to confirm the reliability of my sense experiences? Do you see how you just can't even do that? It's just arguing in a circle. So the whole point is that our implicit trust in the reliability of our sense experiences is the kind of thing that we believe, and it seems like we perfectly rationally believe that, but not on the basis of sense experiences because you couldn't. That'd be arguing in a circle. Okay, so those are some things that just intuitively it looks like we reasonably believe. We believe them perfectly rationally. They don't seem like the kinds of things for which we can have empirical evidence or knowledge. So those seem like counterexamples to the evidentialist claim that you can only rationally believe something if you have evidence that it's true. In all those cases, it looks like we believe things rationally, even though we don't have anything like empirical evidence of the truth of those claims. How are we doing? All right, so let me give you a second reason to think that evidentialism, this view that you can only rationally believe that what you have evidence for, is false. Now that's this, it's incoherent. Okay. This thing that sounds like a truism is actually incoherent. It doesn't even make sense in the first place. Here's why. If we could resurrect W.K. Clifford and bring him back up and bring him onto the stage right now, I would ask him one question, which is, what's your evidence that evidentialism is true? See the problem? The claim that you can only rationally believe what you have empirical evidence for, what's your empirical evidence of that? Has anybody ever conducted a survey and tried to observe rationality of belief or something? No. So it's not, evidentialism is not itself a claim like about our environment that we can explore using our five senses. It's a philosophical claim about the nature of rationality. It's not the kind of thing for which we could even in principle gather empirical evidence. So if it were true, it would be irrational to believe it. I take it that it's just not true. Okay, so the claim that you can only believe that for which you possess sufficient evidence seems to me just to be false. So that's one reason why sometimes people think that faith and reason are in tension with one another, is because they think to have a belief that's rational requires having evidence, and then they go on to say, well, you don't have evidence for your religious beliefs, and therefore they're not well supported, they're not rational. The issue cannot be that straightforward simply because this sort of general sweeping claim that you can only believe something rationally to the extent that you have evidence of its truth just doesn't even make any sense. It's not even coherent. Okay, so that's kind of, how are we doing? We doing okay? This is what I ask my students. I don't know, it's hard for me when I'm not expecting more, anyways, more sleeping, students or whatever. Okay, all right. So, all right, so now, why would anybody believe evidentialism? And that's because there is a grain of truth in it. It's not totally crazy. It's a hasty generalization, but it's not crazy. And so I don't want to give you the impression that I think Clifford was an idiot or something like that, okay? There's a grain of truth in it. Here's the grain of truth. There are some things you really shouldn't believe unless you do possess sufficient evidence. My wife and I just took a flight yesterday. I wouldn't want the mechanic who serviced the plane to just go, it's airworthy, sure, without checking, right? There's some things you can only rationally believe if you have evidence of its truth. It would not be rational for you to believe that there were more than 10 people here at the lecture unless you had evidence of that truth, empirical evidence of that truth. So that's the grain of truth in evidentialism. It's not that all beliefs are such that you can only rationally have them if you have evidence of their truth. But it is true that there are at least some things that one can only rationally believe to the extent that one has evidence of their truth. So now you see what the question is. The question is religious belief one of those kinds of beliefs, right? Is religious belief like morality, the kind of thing you can rationally believe in the absence of empirical evidence? Or is religious belief more like belief in the number of people in this room, which is the kind of thing that you really do have to have empirical evidence of in order to be rational and believe in it? So this is actually a thorny issue that I don't think philosophers have sorted out completely. But I want to sort of in the second half of this talk, I want to talk a little bit about how I understand religious belief in this question about how evidence is related to it. So how do most people come to have belief in God? Well, I think it's fair to say that people who believe in God do not do so on the basis of philosophical arguments. I've taught Intro to Philosophy for, 14 years now at SMU. I always talk about, arguments for and against the existence of God. And I always have students who believe in God, who are in the class, who've never heard of these, right? Most students have never heard of these things. Certainly, I think about, my grandparents. My, grandfather lived to be 96. He was a man of very deep faith. He never, if I said, what do you think of the ontological argument? He would have gone, the what now? He didn't go to college. He didn't study philosophy. And yet he had he seemed to me to have he certainly had a very sincere belief in God. So for him, belief in God was not like this theoretical postulate that he held in order to support his other beliefs or something like that. He came to faith in belief in God in some other way. So what is that way? How do people usually end up finding themselves believing in God? Well, I think that the main way is through what we might describe as being some sort of encounter with God, some sort of religious experience. So I'm going to read you a little passage that was written in an autobiographical essay by a Christian philosopher named Alvin Plantinga. Anybody heard of Alvin Plantinga? He's he's probably the most prominent Christian philosopher alive. I think he's retired now from Notre Dame, but so he wrote this autobiographical essay in which he kind of talked about his own experience of struggling with philosophical questions about the nature of God and the rationality of religious belief while he was an undergraduate at Harvard. And while he was an undergraduate at Harvard, he had this kind of remarkable experience that he recounts in this essay. So he says, one gloomy evening in January, perhaps, I was returning from dinner, walking past Widener Library to my fifth floor room at Thayer Middle. It was dark, windy, raining, and nasty, so he's going up the stairwell by himself. He says, but suddenly it was as if the heavens opened. I heard, so it seemed, music of overwhelming power and grandeur and sweetness. There was light of unimaginable splendor and beauty. It seemed I could see into heaven itself, and I suddenly saw, or perhaps felt with great clarity and persuasion and conviction, that the Lord was really there and was all that I had thought. He said the effects of this experience lingered for a long time. I was still caught up in arguments about the existence of God, but they often seemed to me merely academic, of little existential concern, as if one were to argue about whether there really had been a past, for example, or whether there really were other, conscious beings as opposed to merely cleverly constructed robots, et cetera. He's kind of talking about some recherche, issues in philosophy. And what he's saying here is he had an experience that had this very vivid feeling to it that left him with this kind of like conviction that God was there with him. And that carried way more conviction than any of these intellectual debates he was having with his fellow students and with faculty at Harvard. So that's pretty, I think, a little bit uncommon. I think it's fair to say to have an experience that's that vivid. But Plantinga in other places writes about other kinds of sort of more familiar experiences, or we might call them encounters with God, that I actually think for Christians are very commonplace, if not close to ubiquitous. So one more quote here I'm going to read. So here's the kind of thing that Plantinga talks about. He says, God has so created us that we have a tendency or a disposition to see his hand in the world around us. Let's see, he goes on to say, many sorts of conditions may trigger this disposition. Upon reading the Bible, one may be impressed with a deep sense that God is speaking to one. Upon having done what I know is cheap or wrong or wicked, I may feel guilty in God's sight and form the belief God disapproves of what I've done. Upon confession and repentance, I may feel forgiven, forming the belief God forgives me for what I've done. A person in grave danger may turn to God, asking for his protection and help, and of course he or she then forms the belief that God is indeed able to hear and to help if he sees fit. When life is sweet and satisfying, a spontaneous sense of gratitude may well up within the soul. Someone in this condition may thank and praise the Lord for his goodness and will, of course, form the accompanying belief that indeed the Lord is to be thanked and praised. I think a lot of us can actually relate to those kinds of encounters with the Lord if you haven't had the more kind of heavens opening kind of experience. I feel like I've had those kinds of experience that I just read from that quote, and some that are kind of in between those and the kind of grand experience that Plantinga had in the stairway at Harvard. But what these encounters with God kind of have in common is that belief in God kind of comes downstream of the encounter with God. So it's like, I don't believe that my wife Joy exists and then I met her. It's like I met her and then I believe that God exists as a result of that encounter with her. Did I say God exists? I met, oh dear, I have a very high view of my wife, you can tell. So I met Joy, and then I believed that she exists. Okay, that was a consequence of me actually encountering her. So actually what I want to suggest is that religious experience has a lot of things actually in common with sensory experiences. The way in which you have a sensory experience that can lead you to hold an empirical belief is actually has some things in common with the way in which a religious experience can lead you to have a religious belief. So what are some things that they have in common? So one thing that both our sensory experiences have in common with religious experiences is that they both have a characteristic way that they feel. I'll give you more free philosophy terminology here at no charge. The word that philosophers like to use is called phenomenology. So there's a particular phenomenology of perceptual experience. That is to say, there's a way that it feels when you see a stop sign, right? It looks a certain way. And you might wonder if somebody who's colorblind has the same phenomenological experience of the stop sign, okay? That is to say, does it feel the same way? Does it kind of look the same way subjectively to that person when they see the stop sign as it does to me, and I'm not colorblind? Similarly, what Plantinga is describing, this overwhelming sort of sense of God's presence, this peace, that there's a very vivid way in which encountering God can feel. So perceptual experiences and religious experiences are both characterized by having a certain characteristic way that they feel. It feels like something to undergo one of these kinds of experiences. Another thing that they have in common, another thing that religious experiences have in common with perceptual experiences, is that they're often automatically accompanied by conviction of the truth of a claim. So, can you see me? All right. So I bet you believed that I was waving my arm, right? You didn't have to think about it. It just happened like that, okay? You form your belief more or less automatically with pretty close to complete conviction instantly as a result of having a certain sensory experience that you were not expecting to have, right? You're probably not a lot of speakers just stand there silently waving one arm, but that's philosophy professors for you. So the point is that our perceptual experiences carry with them just kind of immediate conviction of the truth of whatever it is that we're experiencing, and that's actually a pretty decent way to describe religious experience. When you are in the mountains and you look at, my wife and I were just in Colorado, in the mountains, you look out over the beauty of the mountains, you think to yourself, you might find yourself, not necessarily, okay, but you might find yourself feeling convinced that this was made by, like a good creator, right, who loves me. So religious experiences can carry a sense of conviction of the truth of a claim in much the same way that perceptual experiences do. Now, they're different in some ways, too, okay? There's some differences. One difference is that when we have a perceptual experience that causes us to have an empirical belief, a lot of times when that happens, the experience is, in some sense, shareable or public. Okay, so, for example, my mom texted me this morning and said, believe it or not, there's a bear running down my street. Okay, she's lived there 3 years or something, never seen bears anywhere in her neighborhood. This was something she was not expecting to see this morning. So what do you think she did? Well, first of all, she grabbed her phone to try to get a picture of it, but she also talked to her neighbors about it. And so the idea is that she was having a certain perceptual experience, a characteristically bear-like experience that led her to believe that she was seeing a bear. And what she could do is she could try to get other people to put themselves in a situation where they could have the same basic kind of sensory experience to confirm what she was experiencing, right? So a lot of times our empirical beliefs are based on sensory experiences that are sort of shareable in that way. If I go out and say, there's a full moon tonight, and Joy says, that's kind of weird. I thought it said in the newspaper that it was going to be a waning gibbous instead of a full moon. I could say, just philosophers make up examples. So anyways, I could say, I could think of something to do to put her in a position to have an experience that's similar to mine. Namely, come outside and look, right? So there's a way in which perceptual experiences, when they support our empirical beliefs, are shareable in this way. And this is actually one of the wonderful things about the empirical sciences. I do not want to give you the impression that I am anti-science or something like that. If I've left you with that impression, I've not communicated clearly, because one of the beautiful things about the empirical sciences is precisely that they give us a way to settle disputes by appealing to publicly available evidence, right? You don't have to take my word for it that this vaccine is, effective or whatever. You can just do the test yourself, right? Get your own chemicals, mix them together, stab them in people's arms and see what happens. You can just do it for yourself. At the end of the day, you do not have to take somebody else's word for it. You can just do it for yourself, okay? So there's a public availability of means for checking our empirical beliefs against our experiences, and that's not necessarily the case with religious experience. Of course, if I have an encounter with God, I might encourage my friends to go on a retreat or read the Bible, put themselves in positions where I hope they have an encounter with God that leads them to belief in God, but it might not happen, right? It might not happen. And so there's something sort of essentially kind of private about religious belief in that way. So, okay, does that mean that religious belief is somehow less rational? No, I don't think it does. Suppose you get bonked on the head, you're taken to the doctor, and the doctor says, do you see stars? Now, that question that the doctor is asking you is about what you're experiencing in that moment, and that is a question that you and only you can settle right? As much as Bill Clinton says he feels your pain, he can't literally feel your actual pain. And nobody, even if other people see stars, when they get bonked on the heads, they're not seeing the stars you see. There's something essentially private about that experience you have if you're seeing stars in your visual field. After you get bonked on the head, it doesn't mean that it's any less rational for you to form beliefs about whether or not you've had a concussion, for example, because the experience that you base that on is somehow private to you. Okay, so this is all to say I think there's actually quite a bit in common between perceptual experience and the way that supports our empirical beliefs on the one hand, and religious experience in the way that engenders religious belief on the other hand. So what does this have to do with faith? Okay, so what is faith, and what does this have to do with all this stuff, and what does it have to do with rationality? And I've got 5 minutes to talk about faith, is that right? Okay, no problem. So I'm gonna borrow some things from Laura Bouchak, who's like one of the great young epistemologists who's working right now. She's at Princeton University, and she actually wrote her dissertation on connections between what you might call faith and decision theory. Okay, so she's kind of an amazing philosopher, but I'm going to kind of distill down and perhaps in the process slightly distort some of the things she has to say about faith. So here's what faith involves. So first of all, you can't have faith. So I'm going to talk about faith in a proposition, faith that a claim is true, as opposed to faith in a person, or like trusting a person. So what it means to have faith that a given claim is true first involves a lack of certainty. Now, you might think that to have faith, you have complete certainty. I don't think that's quite true, right? You can't really have faith that 2 + 2 is 4. It's just sort of too obvious. It's too certain. That doesn't really involve faith. So first of all, to have faith in a claim, it must be that the claim is uncertain. Secondly, to have faith in a claim, as she puts it, involves taking an action or doing some action that's risky on the basis of that claim. What do I mean by risky? I mean, if the claim is false, things turn out worse for you. All right, so that's what faith seems to involve as well. And then third, and sort of controversially perhaps, she says faith involves suspending your search for additional evidence that would bear on the truth of the claim. All right, so here's what she has in mind. Suppose that you have asked your husband to pick you up from the airport, and so do you know for certain that your husband will remember? Well, if it's Joy's husband, no, you're not going to know this for certain. Okay, so it's an uncertain claim. If you are constantly texting and checking, that's indication that you don't have faith. All right, so what it means to have faith involves not checking, not geolocating their phone to see if they're on the way, and so on. That's part of what it is to have faith. Now the question is faith so conceived rational? Is it rational to have faith if that's what faith is? And you might think this last point in particular about suspending the search for additional evidence means that faith is not rational. You might think that it's not rational, but the real answer, of course, is that it depends. It depends. So in some situations, of course, faith might be irrational because it might be irrational for you to suspend your search for evidence that bears on the truth of the claim. If the claim is really hotly contested and there's lots of arguments sort of for and against and so on, and there's lots of kind of easily available evidence that could fully sort of swing the scales one way or the other, then you might be in a situation where to cut off your investigation is actually like putting your head in the sand. But the fact of the matter is that we have to suspend our search for evidence all the time because that's life. We only live for so long. We only have so much time. We only have so many resources. When I have this experience every time there's an election. I'm trying to do research and kind of figure out who's the best person to vote for, and then eventually the election's there, and I feel like I don't fully know who's the best person to vote for, but I sort of do my best, okay? And that seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And in fact, if you spend all your time searching for evidence that bears on a particular claim, you're going to starve to death, right? So it's perfectly reasonable, and in fact, it's necessary to suspend your search for new evidence. And she thinks that it's particularly reasonable and indeed rational to do this in cases that meet the following conditions. One condition is that you're unlikely to encounter evidence that's going to seriously sway things one way or the other. And the second is that the costs of searching for new evidence are really high. So let me see if I can kind of give you an example where I think you could have rational faith, not in a religious context, but just in an everyday kind of context. So suppose that your son has struggled with addiction, but he's been totally clean and sober for the last 5 years, no relapses. Now suppose that you wake up one morning and for some reason on this particular day, it really matters that he has not relapsed. It really matters to you because, I don't know, you're going to go do something together or something like that. It doesn't matter what the case is. Now, in this case, you're going in with a certain amount of evidence that he will be sober this day because he's got a good track record, right? But you don't know for sure, right? That's just how it is. You don't know for sure. So we've got uncertainty. Now, secondly, because you're depending on him this day and so forth, you're actually going to make a decision to do something that is risky, where the risk is based on the assumption that he's going to be sober this day and he won't have a relapse. Okay, so the second condition is filled. Now, what about the suspending of gathering for additional evidence? All right, so suppose you really, really decide, I need additional evidence. I've got to investigate. So how could you do that? Well, you could ask him, how are you doing today? You could ask his wife, how's he doing today? If you could, I guess you could like go to his house and go through his trash and look for bottles. You could try to break into his house. You could try to, hire a private investigator to follow him around. But can you see that doing those kinds of activities might actually be really harmful in that context? I mean, if you ask him, how are you doing today? You might be communicating to him that you don't have confidence in him, and that could be disruptive to your relationship. Asking his wife might, drag her into this and all this. That's bad to do. Obviously, if you're spying on him or breaking into his house, you're doing something, that's of questionable legality, if nothing else. So it seems like in this case, the value of the additional evidence you'd be gathering is really low relative to the costs of gathering it. So that's why it would actually be perfectly rational in this kind of a case to just have faith that your son is doing okay today, and to not gather additional evidence in this kind of a case. So what does that mean for religious belief? Well, that means that religious faith, is it rational? It kind of depends, right? I think, you could be in a situation like my, 90-year-old grandfather. He's passed away now, but when he was 90 years old, for him to kind of like suddenly, start reading Nietzsche or something and start getting into the search for evidence that bears on the question of God's existence would be really unlikely to yield anything that would fundamentally change his mind relative to the cost of that for him at that stage of life. I mean, it just depends on your stage of life. I'm my grandfather's specific stage of life at that time, that wouldn't have made any sense at all for him to be doing that. So I don't think that would have been so in his case, I think sort of saying, for me, the question of God's existence is settled. I've had encounters with God. I feel like I have a relationship with God. I know God, and I'm not really unlikely to encounter any evidence that's going to kind of tip the scales one way or the other. I think that seems, in his situation, to be relative to be reasonable, to be rational. But in the case of, and this is kind of my last thought, but if for example, you have a colleague who is wanting to engage with you about difficult questions, for you to just kind of put your head in the sand and avoid that colleague out of fear of what might come up in these conversations would not necessarily be rational. I mean, it could be that the costs of engaging in conversation are relatively low, so there's really no reason why you shouldn't do that. Okay, so what does this mean for us? I think that, again, whether your faith is rational depends, first of all, on have you encountered God? Like, have you had some experience of God? It does depend to a certain extent. I don't want to make you think that philosophical debates and arguments are totally useless about debates about the existence of God. I think to the extent that you've grappled with that to a certain extent, that can have a bearing, at any rate, on whether your faith in God is rational. And then lastly, I think whether you're open to engaging with ideas that bear on the question of God's existence, the ideas that bear on the truth of various doctrines and so on, versus your fearfulness and avoidance of those issues and kind of why you're either engaging or not engaging with those issues. Those are all things that kind of bear on the question of whether your faith is rational. So I'm just going to conclude with this thought that here's one of the great things about faith. I think one of the great things about faith is that to have faith in God involves, to a certain extent, not feeling like your belief in God is constantly up for debate. And what that means is you actually can engage in debate with other people, or at least a discussion. Actually, I don't like debates very much, but I like discussions with other people to kind of hear what they believe and why. You can kind of I think that faith frees you up to be open and to engage with people who disagree with you. And in that way, hopefully by having more faith, we can be more rational. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Matt. Oh man, he's tall. Just a second. All right, what we're going to do now is the pizza has come. If you need a bite to eat before you go, there's definitely enough for a slice, maybe two. I would say restrain yourselves. Let's get everybody having some. And then if there's more, please, by all means, help yourself. We're going to take about 10 minutes. I know you've been writing questions down. If you haven't, please consider writing them down now. Volunteers are now going to move through the room and begin to collect those questions from you. Matt is going to put them in order, and then he's going to respond to the questions in about 10 minutes. David Tribble, if you'd come back and sing for us for a little bit, we'd appreciate it. David. Hey, David. You're up. You got about 10 minutes.
Can I get testify. You testify. Living through these hard times, long nights, dry bones, they brought back to life. I testify. You testify. We testify what God has done. What God has done. God has done. God has done. Thank you, folks. Often do you think about life, purpose and desire, between a Monday morning and Saturday night? So many places to go, got a place that you call home. Sometimes it doesn't feel like that at all. So when you get back where you went, don't expect this house to be flipped, looking at different than it did before you left. Walls are caving in, ceiling escalator. Maybe you're tired to fix it all yourself. You can't tell. Say they don't like it when I say Jesus. In these songs here that I'm singing this, why don't you sing about drinking for change? Say what makes you so sure. Don't expect me to listen just because. Say that Jesus loves me in a serious tone. Say they nailed him to a cross, wood and blood, covered him up with a rock that they thought he couldn't move. Oh, young got work to be done. Lord have mercy, is that the truth? When he walked this earth, he understand whatever it is going looked at me and said, when I get back where I've gone, try to flip this old house around. You know, I tried myself a few times. That was a joke. It seems impossible. Too much work to do. The truth is, man, you know, I've got nothing to lose. I said, how about a helping hand? This time around, it'll be worth it. You won't recognize it when it's through. When it's through. Said in case you didn't know, in case you didn't know, Jesus was a carpenter. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys.
Oh. Why not?
I could just stay a minute of your time. It wouldn't take long. Tell you what's on my heart, what's weighing on my mind. Oh, it's more than a song. If I could just stay a minute of your day, it wouldn't take long. Talk about the things that don't make the headline. Oh, don't you wanna make a difference this time? But we learn to put it out every time we get close, figuring it out. Oh, but it wouldn't take long. Circumstance, take a number, we'll call you up. Somebody's taking the call. No, I wouldn't say this is life or death. Oh, but maybe but we learn to put it out every time we get close, figuring it out. Oh, but it wouldn't take long. Don't you wanna make a difference this time? Come out on the other side. We could all do some soul go searching together, see what we might find. Come out on the other side.
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you.
Put your hands together again for David Tribble. And remember, he does have some merchandise in the back, so if you'd like to check that out, please do. All right, we're going to have Matt come back up. He will be here afterwards for a little bit, and so if you really have a pressing question and he doesn't get to it, stick around. He'll stay for a minute, but we're going to try to keep this section to 20 minutes. So about 18 minutes in, I'll let him know that he can take one more question. So at this point, would you welcome back Matt Lockard? Thank you.
All right, thanks. Wow, excellent questions, amazing questions. And I will do my best to get to as many as possible, but yes, as mentioned, I'll be sticking around, so I'd be happy to talk afterwards. So the first one I'm gonna, these aren't in any particular order, but can we have faith and walk with open questions is one question I got. And I think actually, given the definition of faith that I was working with, the question was, can we have faith and walk with open questions? And the answer to that is you must have some open questions in order to have faith. Because remember, according to this definition of faith that I was borrowing from Laura Bushak, it turns out that, oh, there we go. It turns out that if you have no open questions, you have complete certainty, then there is no room for faith. So that was, so I don't think that you definitely should not think of your questions as being in some sense incompatible with faith. I think that's actually part of what faith involves. And not just in the religious realm, okay, that actually goes for other areas as well, kind of like we discussed. So I got a couple questions about my profession. I do know that, we philosophers, I always wonder what our reputation is out there in the world, but one of the questions is about, like, why are so many philosophers against religion? Are they really? And then, like, what is, knowing what you've studied in your profession, how's this shaped your faith or your belief in God? So it is true that most philosophers are probably atheists or agnostics of some form or another. In fact, I think I saw a survey of philosophers around a few years ago that indicated that. And it's a pretty substantial majority, but the minority of us who are theists are a relatively substantial minority. So actually there's more Christians, I'm going to say this and then somebody's going to Google it and I'm going to regret saying this, but I think there's more Christians sort of proportionally in philosophy than there are in a lot of academic disciplines. So really there's nothing sort of special about philosophy that would incline somebody towards atheism. If anything, philosophers tend to be skeptical and contrarian, and so it's in some ways easier to be a theist and be a rabble-rousing theist. But I've been sort of surprised at the range of beliefs, and certainly when I was in so I went to undergraduate college at Whitworth College in Spokane, Washington, which is a Christian university. There were like 1,500 students in the entire school, and it was this wonderful, supportive kind of Christian atmosphere. And then I went to UCLA for graduate school and was just thrown into this huge major, research university. And I definitely expected to be in the minority as a believer, and I was, but I was also surprised at how many, what a diversity of views there were. And so I had some professors I had one who was just completely committed Catholic, and I had one who was a deist, sort of a kind of I don't know, you'd say like a Jeffersonian sort of deist who believed in the existence of God but didn't believe in miracles, for example, and just a whole range, and so certainly a lot of atheists as well. I think that when you're in academia, you're just exposed to so many views. I mean, I remember people will entertain views that you would not think to entertain. I'm within the first time I was back on campus after 9/11, I was sitting at a table with somebody who said, I don't know, do you think terrorism is ever justified? And I was totally speechless. I mean, it was so soon after it just happened. And I was appalled and shocked, and people just started debating it. Now, the person who said that is not in favor of terrorism, but that's just kind of the thing is like, let's just sort of explore these ideas. And so I think what that means is that to stake out a view, especially a view that feels kind of parochial and exclusive of others, like, you know, I believe in God, and here's kind of, that means I live my life in a certain way, and so on, can feel, can be kind of hard to do, but I think it's more a matter of like the general climate in academia than it is to do with something specific to philosophy. That said, let me just say, my department is wonderful. So despite the fact that we have lots of different, philosophical views and all of that, my colleagues are just absolutely, people who I really, really respect. The most strident atheist in our department is also our department chair, and he's also one of my favorite people in the department. He's a person who I just really enjoy him so much. So, and I have a humongous amount of respect for him. So, it's been kind of amazing for me, and really, I think, redemptive in a way for me to have so many fruitful relationships with people who really disagree with me about very fundamental things, but we can get along and we can, do the department and do things together, and that's really great. So a question about God of the gaps. I did not talk about the God of the gaps. So here's an objection to religious belief. It's like we only believe in God to explain things that we can't explain in a better way. So why is there life? Well, because God created life. Oh, the theory of evolution comes along, and now we've lost a reason to believe in God. And the thought being that as science progresses and is able to explain more and more, there's less and less need to sort of posit the existence of God to explain those things. Well, I do think that that's a problem if, for you, the existence of God is a theoretical posit on par with the theoretical posits of science. But if you believe in God because you've had some sort of like an encounter with God and you're trying to make sense of that, that's a really kind of different stance that you're taking with respect to your faith. So I am very sympathetic with this concern about religious belief being a matter of just inserting God into some explanatory paradigm where we don't currently have a way of explaining something, and then saying, well, therefore it was God. That's a leap of logic that usually is not justified. But I don't think that that's necessarily why people believe in God in general or anything, but it is maybe sometimes a reason why some people have believed in God, and I do think that that's usually not rationally justifiable. I got a couple of questions about sort of coherence and group think. Not exactly group think, but the questions are kind of like this. Christians all get together and we just try to make sense of our beliefs, and then atheists get together and they try to make sense of their beliefs, and don't we kind of have these like balkanized communities of like thinking people? Is that a problem? Are we all just kind of getting together and trying to affirm our beliefs? Is that a problem? So the answer is potentially. It certainly is. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why I very consciously chose not to work at a Christian university, even though I work at a university with Methodists in its title. But there's no, just so you know, like at SMU, there's no expectation that people who work there have any particular religious creed. So, people from all different faiths and no faith at all work at SMU, and there's no creedal requirement for working at SMU. And I chose that intentionally, partly because I do think that like echo chambers are a problem. It's a problem when it comes to faith, but it's just as big of a problem, I think, when it comes to politics. Is my time up? So I won't get into politics, but I do think that there is a danger when we all just talk with other people who agree with us and seek out views that confirm our own views. I want to just say that this view of faith is, at some point, kind of cutting off further inquiry is really only rationally defensible in cases where you're not, you don't kind of have a plausible way of engaging with other people who might bring to mind, bring to your attention significant considerations that could potentially change your mind. So that's a kind of, you should be very loath to say, I'm a person of faith, therefore I'm not investigating the issue any further, okay? That the conditions under which that's rationally defensible are not gonna be ubiquitous, all right? And so I would be, I myself want to err on the side of digging for useless information too much than to just err on the side of of closing off a conversation with others. So I think that that's important. As a religious believer, I think you can actually really enrich and deepen your faith. I know that, for example, I have Muslim students who absolutely inspire me with the depth of their devotion. And so for me, that's been a very meaningful experience to engage with students who take their faith so seriously, even though they're coming from a different perspective. And so similarly, engaging with people who don't believe in God at all can actually really deepen and enrich your faith. It's not something I think we should be afraid of, and that goes not just for religious beliefs, but for others as well. Let's see here. So let's see. One question is, how should Christians reconcile the idea of faith in miracles with rationality? So, wow, this is such a good question, and there's been so much written on this. So there's been so much written about this. There's all these philosophical issues that have to do with your view of natural laws, and whether you think natural laws are can have exceptions, or whether they're baked into the. And so there's one view according to which natural laws are completely immutable because they. Things obeying natural laws makes it what it is. So there's this view according to which what makes this the physical object it is just that it obeys certain natural laws. And if you have that view, then you're going to think miracles are completely impossible. On the other hand, if you think that natural laws are just generalizations about the way things tend to happen, then you're going to have the view according to which there's no special reason why natural laws couldn't have exceptions on those occasions that people think of as miracles. Now, Hume, the philosopher David Hume, 17th century, I want to say, I should know this off the top of my head, but he famously had this argument against, I know his argument's better than I know his dates, but anyways, I'm just digging the hole deeper. But anyways, David Hume had this famous argument where he basically says it's always irrational to believe in a miracle, and here's why. Because a miracle is so improbable. What's the odds that a pink elephant is just going to pop into existence right here? Boom, right? They're so low, I'd bet my life against it to get a free beer, right? That's how confident I am that that's not going to happen in the next 5 seconds. That's free beer as far as I'm concerned. So I'm extremely confident that a pink elephant is not going to pop into existence right in front of me in the next 5 seconds. So if somebody were to come and say to me, oh my gosh, a pink elephant just popped into existence in front of me 5 seconds ago or something, what they're telling me is less probable than that they're lying. See that? What they're telling me is so improbable, it's just always more rational to assume that they're lying, that they were hallucinating, or that some other explanation better accounts for what they're saying other than that what they're saying is actually true. So he thought, the resurrection or something would be an example of that. What are the odds that somebody rises from the dead? The problem is, I think that principle in general is false. So suppose suppose your friend says, oh my gosh, your car just got sideswiped by, a yellow Ferrari or something, okay, out on the car. What are the odds that your car is going to get sideswiped by a yellow Ferrari? What are the odds that happened in the last minute? Very small, and in fact, it's much less probable than that somebody's lying to you. So I think this is called Hume's principle, that you should never believe an account that relays a fact that's less probable than the likelihood that the person who's relaying it is deceived or something. And I just don't think it's true. I think there's lots of counterexamples to that. That's not a full answer about Christians and miracles, but what I'm trying to say is I don't think there's anything the arguments I've seen that try to raise some special problem for belief in miracles seem to me to not be super compelling. It tends to be the case that, again, if somebody relays something that's really crazy, you should probably be kind of skeptical of that, but you should also, it doesn't necessarily mean that necessarily it would be irrational to believe in it. Okay, so many good questions. Absolutely. All right. Okay, so Somebody asked me if I believe Jesus is God. Yes, I do. That's the answer to that question. Do religious experiences count as evidence? Can the evidentialist see religious experience like the evidence that I have that there are more than 10 people in this room? The answer to that is you could say that. This is a great question, by the way. It's exactly the kind of question I would expect to get from one of my colleagues or something. Okay, so religious experience, isn't that just kind of like isn't that a kind of evidence or something? I guess I would say yes, but it's different in character from ordinary sensory experience in the following sense. It's very hard to identify a sense modality that goes with it. So in the case of my sense experience, on the basis of which I believe there's more than 10 people in this room, I can identify specific sense modalities like vision, hearing, and so on. But in the case of a religious experience, it's hard to identify a specific sensory modality. Is it my sense of sight? Is it my sense of hearing? So that's one way in which it's different. If you wanted to consider it an experience as well, then sure, I wouldn't want to get into a semantic debate about it. But it's just kind of important to note certain forms of similarity and certain forms of difference. So I've had a couple of questions about cases where you've had a religious experience of one sort or another, and you have others in your life who haven't had that experience. And so there's this question, like, sort of, is it me or them, right? So what am I supposed to do with that? So I do think that, I guess what I would say, there's one question is like, how do I think about that intellectually? Does that mean that I shouldn't trust my encounter, this thing that felt at the time like an encounter with God, because other people I know and trust and love haven't had that similar experience? That's a kind of intellectual question about the rationality of religious beliefs that are based on those kinds of experiences. Another question is kind of like a personal question about how do I approach other people in my life with this, and is this something I should encourage them to do? I encourage my friends to go to retreats and put themselves on the mountaintop and try to have these kinds of experiences. So when it comes to the intellectual question, I do think that it's like when you have an experience of God and someone you know and love and trust doesn't, there is a way in which it can kind of be like my mom seeing the bear in the running down the street, and then she calls her neighbors and says, "Look, bear, out, look out at the front window," and they look and there's nothing there. And then they go and they look for, maybe they can't even see claw marks and stuff, and there's just like, the moment is sort of gone, right? How should my mom rationally respond in that kind of a situation? Well, I actually do think that my mom's confidence that she saw a bear should come down just a little bit. I think it's actually a rational response on her part. She could be, well, maybe it was some other kind, was it really here? What? But I mean, come on, she saw, it was a clear day, it was like just right there and so on. I think it would be kind of crazy for her to go, I guess I hallucinated, right? So I do think that it would be sort of rational, as philosophers say, for her credence in the belief to be lowered a little bit in light of the fact that the people around her don't have similar experiences, but it by no means follows that it's just like suddenly crazy for her to believe that she saw a bear and she shouldn't think that anymore. Okay, great question. Is belief in the Trinity irrational? I think that's your guys' department. I mean, if I had a clear theory of what it is to be a person, such that it was impossible for there to be one God in three persons, I guess I would say yes. But personhood is like a really tricky subject. I mean, are you the same person that you were 10 years ago, 30 years ago? I mean, no molecule in your body was there. If you're old enough like me, I think I'm old enough that I think at a certain point, I think like our molecules are kind of getting swapped out and so forth. So it's like the ship of Theseus. If you know the story about the ship that they're having to repair as they go and they get to the end of their journey, they've replaced every board in the ship. Is that the same ship or is it a different ship? The answer is, I don't know. Okay. I mean, philosophers ask questions like this. Suppose that while they're swapping out the boards, they keep another ship behind them that's holding old boards. So they get to their destination, they take if you say this is the same ship, well, they can take all the old boards, reconstitute a ship out of that. Now, isn't that the original ship? Because it's a ship and it's the original board. Okay, that's a metaphysics question, and I don't do metaphysics. Okay, so that is all to say that questions like the Trinity are certainly perplexing. But I mean to say that it's like a straight up contradiction. I teach logic. I can tell you it's not like a formal contradiction unless you take on board some assumptions that would be contentious. So I've never really been particularly bothered by the doctrine of the Trinity. Okay, so Okay, and a couple questions about like how to approach loved ones who you want to have encounter God. And I said earlier the thing about the intellectual response to that, but I didn't say what the sort of personal response to that is. I think that there's danger, like if you have someone in your life and you've had an encounter with God, there's someone in your life you really want them to have an encounter with God. All I can say is that's sort of between them and God at the end of the day. Oh. And I say this because I have 3 children and my oldest is 13. And so one of the questions is like, what do you say to a teenager who has doubts about God? And whatever I say, I'm going to eat my words within a few years, I'm sure. But I think that the approach that we're trying to take, like with our kids, is to take their questions seriously and not to make them feel bad for having questions. And actually, this kind of goes to this first question about whether you can have faith and still like have open questions. And there's some other questions in here about theories and like if a theory is internally consistent, does that necessarily mean it's true and so on? And this goes to the God of Gap question. All these questions are kind of like related in one way or another, actually, at a deep enough level. So my own view is that I'm actually, and this is just me telling you about Matt Lockard, the philosopher, but my inclination is I'm not really a systematician. Okay, so that means that I don't put a huge premium on constructing theories. And the reason why is because I've seen so many cases where philosophers have squeezed really hard to try to get a nice tight theory, and they've kind of squeezed all the truth out of it. And they're left with something that's, at the end of the day, absurd. And then the view ends up just sort of falling apart or going away, and everybody else says, we don't really see the point of this anymore. So I do think that, like, for example, the physics, the theory of general relativity is important, quantum theory is important. There is a place for theories. Theories are like sets of interrelated claims that help explain other things. And obviously that's important. It's like why we have technology and so on. But in philosophy, my approach has always been to have faith and to seek understanding. So that is to say, when I come up against something in my faith that I don't fully understand, what I want to do is sort of like hold that, and as a Christian, I kind of try to have some patience with that and sort of say, like, God, help me to kind of work my way through this and just help me to sort of seek understanding and maybe sort a few things out. So what you've seen from me today is kind of a way in which I've tried to do that with faith and reason. And it's not a complete project. I haven't given you like a completely satisfying theory, but I think it's more important to just be like sincere about what you do know and what you don't know, and less concerned with like having all the right answers. And that's kind of what a theory gives you, the feeling like you've got all the right answers, but I don't know that that's what's most important in life. I think it's more important to sort of be sincere. So when your child if you have a child or if you have friends who have questions, I think it's important, and I think you should just sort of be relaxed about that. Definitely don't pretend like you have all the answers, because I guarantee you don't, even if you think you do. I definitely don't. Nobody does. And so it's okay to just like give them space to sort that through. And they might end up with a faith that makes you uncomfortable in some ways and so on and so forth. But I think at the end of the day, just encouraging that. Okay. I'm so sorry to everybody. I'm talking so much. Let's see. Yeah. So I think I've kind of like been talking so broadly, I've touched in one way or another on most of these. So I guess, okay, last question sort of says, do you believe in blind faith, or in your profession, do you feel the need to always dig deeper for evidence to substantiate what you feel? Well, so again, I don't think you actually do need evidence for everything, because I think that's kind of what I started the talk with, was the view that there are some things that we believe, but not on the basis of empirical evidence. So again, in some cases, what's more important is understanding. And so I guess the way that this looks for me in my profession is to, again, try to engage with ideas, including ideas that are uncomfortable. And I've had a lot of it, like I said, kind of sharing that story about graduate school. That was like the thing I learned in graduate school, is how to like sit with really, really hard questions that I never maybe even would have occurred to me to think, and to just kind of give them time and just like sit there, not be in too much of a hurry to impose an answer, but let the answers kind of come through just sort of like faithfully thinking it through. So thanks for giving me an opportunity to do that with you tonight, and I'll stick around to answer the many, many questions I did not get to. Thank you.
Matt, that was really a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your heart and your mind. If you have questions for him, do find him. Let me just say a couple more things before we wrap up. This is important. Dr. Jody Elder will be with us next week, and she's speaking on spirituality and mental wellness. And I think in a time like this, that's a critical topic, spirituality and mental wellness. It'll be right here at Four Corners Brewery. And again, that's all we've got for tonight. Thank you. Thanks to our hosts who helped put pizza together, Bob Johnston for a great series. God bless you. Good night. Thank you for coming.